Thank you all. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Nancy Popkin. We're here today to talk about navigating services, where and how to get help. As I said, my name is Nancy Popkin. I'm one of the autism resource specialists here at the Autism Society of North Carolina. There are about 20 of us scattered around the state based out of our regional offices. I'm based out of our Charlotte office. And one thing we all have in common is that we are all parents of children with autism. Just so you know, I have a 26-year-old son with autism diagnosed here in North Carolina back in 1996. So this navigating services stuff is stuff I live as well as talk about. So today we are going to cover a couple things. We're going to talk about what services exist here in North Carolina, how eligibility is determined, and how you go about applying, who you talk to for those services, and how you pay for those things. I know that payment part is kind of weird. It's not a system where we have entitlements. You have a diagnosis with autism and all of these services come to you. In fact, not everyone with autism will be eligible for every service I talk about today. So we'll talk about how we determine that eligibility in a minute. But when we think about services, we have to start with the individual with autism spectrum disorder. They're in the middle of that triangle of consideration, and we need to determine what their needs are. So we're not thinking about this is a person with autism, what needs go with a person with autism. We're thinking about this person and what their needs are. We also have to look at what funding sources are available to that person. That will vary from person to person, as you will see. And then finally, we look at what services are attached to those funding sources. What services will address the specific needs that that single person may have. So again, if you're a parent, you're thinking about your kid, what your kid needs, because while we know, there are some overarching characteristics of autism that we see across the spectrum, everyone with autism is unique and different. So we're going to start off by defining what we mean by services. And I use a broad interpretation of this word. Services refers to any assistance an individual receives that provides help with them learning new skills, accessing opportunities in their community, providing support with their daily living, and maintaining their health and well-being. And with that definition, there are a lot of things that fall under that services umbrella. School services would certainly be one, getting some help maybe in the home, services on the job, therapies that you might access, or even a specialized living situation outside of the family home. So these are all examples of services, and each of them has a different, access point, a different process for determining eligibility, and different funding streams to access those things. So when we think about some of the potential specific services that one might be interested in, I'll show you some of these terms. These are really the main ones that we see. So that community living and support, which would be the services that help somebody care for themselves or build skills in the home to do daily chores or take care of the home and themselves in their living space. Community networking, so getting out into the community, whether it's to volunteer or to work or to participate in activities. Day supports, this is a term used for adults who are no longer in school but need support during the day. Some of these are facility-based programs. Others can be more one-on-one community-based. Respite is a service that refers to essentially babysitting, somebody caring for a child so that the primary caregiver can take a break. And supported employment services are those related to job coaching and getting help on the job, looking for a job, those sorts of things. So these are actually probably the most common supports that we see for individuals with autism. But here's a more broad array of services that could potentially be accessed depending on the needs of the individual. So just want to point out that includes crisis services. You'll see community navigator and community transition. Those are different things. The navigator is somebody who might help you find maybe a program or help you navigate a system. Community transition would be to help you move from, say, a school environment to an adult living situation, or moving from a group home back into the family home or something like that. I do want to point out specifically the natural supports education for those that do have sort of comprehensive Medicaid funded services, which we will talk about. This is a service that pays for individuals who are caregivers to, but the natural parents, for instance, to gain more education to help them support their child. And we really want to encourage parents to access that when they have it. Supported living would be something like somebody living in their own apartment, but people coming in to provide support and oversight with their living skills, but it keeps them in the community and allows them to live slightly more independently. So this is like I said, a broad array of services, and nothing again is an entitlement, but rather if there's an indication that this would be something that person needs, then this would be covered. And again, these are most typically through Medicaid, and I will get to the Medicaid portion of this program a little further down. So the first thing we want to talk about is how do we determine if you're eligible for support and what support is needed. So, the needs are not just based on me, I see my child and I think they need this and this and this, and I ask for it. It has to be based on something a little more objective. And so we use psychological assessments and evaluations to determine needs. And so we know that you used a psychological assessment and evaluation to diagnose your child with autism. It's the same sorts of evaluations looking at the cognitive skills and academic skills sometimes, adaptive behavior skills, maybe executive functioning skills, some other behavior scales. There would be a broad array of assessments used to look at the needs of an individual and determine what they are. And that data is also used to determine eligibility for each of the services we talk about today. They also can include some personal data that maybe you collect that you're aware of. As a parent myself, I collect data in a number of ways, and data can look like several different things. But if I'm documenting patterns of behavior and I feel like my son needs additional support for something, if I have data to show the frequency of when those things happen, or how often I need to step in, then that documentation is also valuable. So those are things that we would use to determine what the needs are for your child. And then we have to determine what funding you have access to. And it seems like, I think there's an expectation that money is not part of the equation. And it's important to know that no service just comes for free. It has to be paid for somehow. It's possible that an individual with autism will, because of the level of their needs, the degree, and the number of needs they have access to funding sources like Medicaid or Social Security, and we'll talk about those. But then there are others that the family may have access to. For instance, private health insurance. They may have funds of their own, and that's why private pay is actually that first thing there. There are times where you need a service and you may have to pay for part of it or all of it yourself. Health insurance, again, is an important factor. Whether it's a private health insurance plan or Medicaid, another funding source is through the schools. So if your child is eligible for the services through the schools would then pay for the services they get. You don't. There is Medicaid, of course, that will pay for some services. And then also the Medicaid Waiver, which we will talk about, a little bit different from Medicaid. Social Security, some state funds that some of our managed care organizations have access to. And then there are some other services that some particular plans, especially TRICARE and ECHO through the military, have access to. But the first thing to know is, what funding sources do you have access to? And we're going to start with private pay. Back in 2014, there was an act called the Achieving a Better Life Act that was passed on the federal level, and every state needed to develop their implementation plan. In North Carolina, we launched ours in 2017, and this is called an ABLE account that parents can access. And it's very similar to a 529 college savings account. It provides the opportunity for families to save money for future needs. And that can include medical and dental, education, community-based supports, any of those services we were talking about. An ABLE account can cover that. So what does an ABLE account look like? An ABLE account is this savings account of sorts that an individual would have one ABLE account. You do have to meet the criteria that's been established by the supplemental security income through Social Security, that the same criteria they use to have an ABLE account. So there is some criteria to be able to have one. And the disability, in our case, Autism Spectrum Disorder, must have been diagnosed before the age of 26. Anyone can make a contribution to that person's ABLE account, but those contributions cannot exceed $15,000 a year and total. And the owner of the account, so the individual with autism, can also make contributions to the ABLE account. And that's on top of that $15,000 a year. So you can see that allows them to put their wages into the ABLE account. And this is important because when we look at applying for SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income, again, I'll talk about it shortly, and Medicaid, they do look at the assets of the individual with autism. In particular, when they're over the age of 18. If they're under 18, they do look at the parents. But what's important is that the money that's in the ABLE account is not considered an asset when SSI and Medicaid go into looking at assets. And that's true up to the first $100,000 in the ABLE account. If there's money beyond $100,000, they will look at that money. I know for SSI's purposes, if they have over $2,000 in their name, they would not necessarily be eligible for SSI. So this is why having money set aside for somebody with autism in an ABLE account is a safer way to set money aside and not risk accessibility to other funding sources. This is why this is super important. If parents set up a 529 for a child when they were born and started saving, but then the child is diagnosed with autism and it becomes clear that they're not going to access a post-secondary education, which, by the way, not everyone with autism is not able to access post-secondary education. So some people with autism can go to college. So, you know, the 529 funds can be used for that. But in any case, if you cannot use the 529 that was set up for that individual, that money can be rolled over into the ABLE account. But it will count toward that $15,000 annual contribution. So just to keep that in mind. Of course, I just threw a whole lot of information at you about ABLE accounts, but you can read more about that at this website, nc.savewithable.com, or calling that number. Because this is one way that you can set aside your own money and other family members' money to support someone with autism for services in the future. Another option is a special needs trust, very similar to an ABLE account with a couple exceptions. Those funds are set aside to provide goods and services for that individual, and also will not affect the eligibility for Social Security or Medicaid. And in the case of a special needs trust, this is regardless of how much is in the trust. And that's one of the big differences. If you think that the account for your child would exceed $100,000, then it would be wise to look into a special needs trust instead. I know that sounds just impossible, but there are some who that may be the case. And so this is why you need to know the difference between the ABLE account and the special needs trust. There are some expenditures from a special needs trust, the rent, food, clothing, that could be counted as income by Social Security and Medicaid as well. So it could exclude that person from Social Security and Medicaid if the trust funds are used for those purposes. So again, it needs to be really explored thoroughly if that's something that you need to consider. And you would want to do that, you need to do that with an attorney. Special needs trusts can only be written with the help of an attorney. So there are fees involved with setting up a special needs trust, a little different from the ABLE account. So those are two ways to set aside your own funds for future use to pay for services. Again, we're always thinking about how are we going to pay for the services we need. Health insurance is another way to pay for some of the services that may be very beneficial. What health insurance covers will vary from plan to plan. Typically, health insurance covers our health and dental needs, but some plans will cover speech, OT, counseling, and behavior therapies. So it's important to know about your plan. North Carolina did pass an autism insurance law, and that's been in effect for, I want to say, 4 or 5 years now. And so in our version of the autism insurance law, health plans that are for large groups, so employers of 50 or more employees, must include an autism benefit. And there are some providers that or employers that will just opt for that. That's also something they're allowed to do. So there are some smaller employers that have the autism benefit as well. Again, you'll need to look at your individual plan to see if there is an autism benefit involved. What it covers is something called adaptive behavioral treatment. So this is what we're looking for in the plan. And that can include applied behavioral analysis, ABA, but also includes other evidence-based interventions. It also includes the structured teaching model that TEACH employs. And this is important just because both TEACH and ABA are prevalent here in North Carolina. TEACH, of course, has been here a long time. ABA, while it's an approach that's been around a long time, we really haven't had providers in North Carolina, but for the past 5 years or so, as the law went into effect. But it does cover the medically necessary treatment. So it can cover OT, speech therapy, physical therapy if that's warranted, psychiatric services, psychological services, and any pharmacy care. So I've said it already, but I'll say it again. Look at your insurance plan that your child has and see what is covered. It's important to know that the autism portion of that health insurance plan only goes to age 18 and will only cover up to $40,000 of treatment in a given year. So even though your child could stay on your health insurance, for instance, up to age 26, that adaptive behavior treatment associated with autism would not be available past the age of 18. So that's something else to be aware of. I know this is a lot of details to keep track of, but again, knowing what your insurance might get will be helpful. And then there are services through school. Many children with autism have an individualized education plan, which is provided through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it also has a eligibility process. So not everyone with a diagnosis of autism is eligible for an IEP. Some of our students really can adapt to the school environment with accommodations and modifications to the school environment. And that falls under a different law and doesn't involve any specific services. It is the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, that comes with specialized instruction and service. It can also include speech and occupational therapy and physical therapy, again, based on the data and evaluations and observations that are done. So there is an eligibility process. It's not something you opt for. It's based on your child's needs. But the IEP, it's very important to know that that IEP doesn't cover just academic goals. It can also cover functional goals. If your child's needs in the school setting involve functional skills. So for some of our kids, that can include some of that executive functioning difficulty with organization and planning and problem solving, or social skills, knowing how to participate in a conversation with peers and things like that. So, you know, a lot of parents will call us and ask about getting private speech or private OT, and we will often ask how those needs are addressed in the IEP. Even if you're not getting speech services or occupational therapy services through the school, they still can address those needs in some way in the IEP if those needs are presented at the school setting. So this is something that, you know, all of us autism resource specialists feel comfortable talking to parents. You can always contact your autism resource specialist. I'll show you how at the end, to find out more about using the IEP process to make sure you're covering all of your child's current needs while they're enrolled in school. So, so that's something to be aware of. And then there's Medicaid. Medicaid is a huge provider of services in a lot of ways. And part of it is because Medicaid dollars that come into North Carolina from the federal level, as well as those that we set aside within our own state budget, get put into a number of different buckets. And these are the buckets that individuals with autism spectrum disorder need to know about. There are other buckets where Medicaid dollars go, but they are not things that we would access. So these different buckets represent traditional Medicaid, the Medicaid Waiver, something called Early Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment, or EPSDT, and Medicaid Enhanced Services. And I want to talk about each of those and how you access them and what they will lead to. So first, we'll start with traditional Medicaid. Traditional Medicaid is basically health insurance. You're eligible for it because you meet a financial threshold whereby you wouldn't necessarily be able to access health insurance any other way. So our lower income families access Medicaid, and this provides them with traditional Medicaid for doctor's visits, medications, an ER if it were needed. It also can cover something called an intermediate care facility, which they're called ICF-IDD now, which stands for intellectual and developmental disability. But these are residential scenarios where there is significant supervision. It would also include long-term care, personal care, adult care, home, nursing home, those sorts of things. So these are not all necessarily specific to autism, but this is something that if you have Medicaid, you would be able to access. For our purposes, really, it's that health insurance piece to know about. The next bucket of Medicaid dollars is this enhanced services, or they're called B3 services. So if your child has Medicaid and they're eligible for the Medicaid waiver, which I'll talk about in a minute, then they can also access, while they're waiting for the waiver, a couple services that just sort of help get by. So this is not a whole lot of services, but it does include some respite care and a community guide, and depending on what county you're in, some in-home skill building. But it's not a whole lot of services. So the respite might be about 30 hours a week. The community guide may be just 5 hours a month. And it wasn't 30 hours a week, it was 30 hours a month for respite care. Over the age of 18, the only thing that's different is that supported employment is added to that. And so access to a job coach and support with finding a job, keeping a job, that sort of thing for an adult who has Medicaid. And more often than not, our adults are eligible for Medicaid, which I'll explain in a minute. But so it's important to know about these B3 services. EPSDT, or early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment, we call that a catch-all funding for children. So this applies to any child who has Medicaid. If we suspect that if they have autism, they can use the Medicaid. They'll take money from the EPSDT bucket to pay for those diagnostic evaluations. That's where that funding comes from. If you are determined that you have autism and you have Medicaid, then you would have access to things like ABA and structured teaching and other evidence-based practices. So Medicaid does cover those autism or adaptive behavior treatments that we were talking about with health insurance. So this comes out of that EPSDT bucket. And then the final bucket to know about is the North Carolina Home and Community-Based Service Waiver, otherwise known as the North Carolina Innovations Waiver or the North Carolina Medicaid Waiver. Back in the day when my son was so young, it was called CAP, but we haven't called it that for many, many years. Every state has a Medicaid waiver of some sort. It's called a waiver because we waive the financial requirement associated with Medicaid eligibility and look only at the individual's needs based on evaluations. So these cover comprehensive long-term supports, and services in the home and in the community. So some respite care, in-home skill building, personal care, community inclusion, a community navigator, employment supports, pretty much covering all the needs of the day. Depending on the person's needs, that person may get the Medicaid waiver, they may get, 18 hours a week of services, but for our individuals who have really intense needs, it could be 65 hours a week of services. So this is a pretty significant funding stream for a lot of us to look into accessing. And it's important to know that these services are very aggressively goal driven. So we are looking at those evaluations just like we would do with an IEP, developing goals in all the different areas, that people may have needs. And so there's always a plan, a person-centered plan written for a person who's using the home and community-based services waiver, outlining what all the people who are providing the services are working on. Those services are provided both in the community and in the home. And like I said before, it is a waiver looking only at that individual's income and not like the parents, for instance. And this is important. It's waiving that financial requirement as it relates to children primarily, because when they would typically look at Medicaid for traditional Medicaid, they do look at the parent's income. But for this particular bucket, we don't look at the parent's income. We only look at the needs of the child. When that person is an adult, again, we only look at their assets, not the assets of the family, of the parents, even if they live with their parents. So again, it's only at that individual's income. If you're 8 years old and you don't have an income, so you're definitely eligible for Medicaid that way. But they still will look at your autism spectrum disorder needs and how they play out. They do use a tool called the Supports Intensity Scale to determine the actual budget. So this is when I was saying that some people may have 18 hours a week, some people may have 65 hours a week. This is based on the outcome of the SIS, that Support Intensity Scale, which is used every few years once you have those services. Just because you have a diagnosis of autism doesn't mean that you are eligible for the home and community-based services waiver. And this criteria is very interesting and important to know. I apologize that it's such a small font. It was a lot of information to stick in there, but they must have substantial functional limitations in 3 or more areas of life activity as determined by the evaluations you submit when you apply. And those life activities include self-care, understanding and use of language, learning, mobility, self-direction, and capacity for independent living. A lot of our more independent individuals with autism may not show what's considered substantial functional limitations in 3 or more areas and are often not determined to be eligible. But I will tell you that everyone should apply. It's important to apply because don't you be the judge of whether or not your child will meet that criteria. And at the same time, here we go, a little bit bigger there. But at the same time, I don't want somebody to say, I don't think my child will be eligible and not try. It's important to try and apply. I will tell you, I actually had to apply several times for my son to get to a point where the people reading the evaluations could really see how substantial the limitations were for him. And so sometimes you may have to apply several times. I want to make sure that you know the differences between Medicaid versus the Medicaid waiver again. So for Medicaid, we apply through the Department of Social Services, but for the Medicaid waiver, we actually apply to something called a local management entity or managed care organization. There are 8 of them in North Carolina. So depending on what county you live in, that will determine who your MCO is. Most of them go by MCO at this point, Managed Care Organization. So you need to find that out. Again, if you don't know, we have links on our website, but you can also contact your autism resource specialist for your county and find out. The waiver slots are generally managed on a first come, first served basis. And when you apply for the waiver, if your child is determined to be eligible, they will be put on the Registry of Unmet Needs, which is the waiting list. And it's important, if you're listening to me today, to apply for this now if you have not already, because the waiting list in North Carolina has over 14,000 people on it. People are waiting 10 and 12 years to actually get these services. And I know that is absolutely shocking, but it is the reality. And so we really make sure that when we talk to parents directly, anytime a parent calls our office, we try to just make sure that they're on that registry already, because we want to make sure that they do get those services eventually. It's also important to get on the registry because it's important for our legislators who are making budgetary decisions to see how many people need services, and you want to be counted there. So, and then another funding source is Social Security, and this is a little bit different for children and for adults. First, for the children, if you're applying through the Social Security Administration for something called supplemental security income, it will look at the parent's income and assets. And so a lot of our children, most of our children are not eligible for this. But if they were, really important for adults, they will look at the assets again of that individual. So if an adult, and you would do this at the age of 18 or older, if they are not working or not working full time, making more than $2,000 of, that they have as savings, then, they would be eligible for Social Security. And while they do look at wages, they'll look at inheritance. I know family, somebody left a car for someone and they lost their Social Security because of that. They do also, if your child is living in your home, they will factor in for room and board, essentially, if you're not charging them room and board. So some parents will charge their kids room and board, and that allows them to access more of Social Security, that SSI, supplemental security income. But the monthly check that they would get can fluctuate based on what assets they already have. It does include Medicaid. So for a lot of our adults, this is how they get health insurance. They apply for SSI, and then they also get Medicaid. And once they get Medicaid, then they are able to access the B3 services that we talked about earlier. So a lot of things to follow up with. Finally, there is some Medicaid funds that actually get funneled over to vocational rehabilitation. This is an agency through the Department of Health and Human Services that provides employment supports for individuals with disabilities. And actually, the services can begin They actually have some services as early as 14, but essentially 16 is when you can really access services. And these are employment supports. Um, Everything from, applying for a job, learning how to interview, looking for jobs. You would have a job coach who helps you do that. Once you get a job, they would help you learn to do the job, and then they fade the supports. So there is an eligibility process for vocational rehabilitation as well that uses the same evaluations we use to determine eligibility for the North Carolina home and community-based supports or innovations waiver for school, those sorts of things. So adaptive behavior evaluations and autism evaluations, cognitive evaluations, and the like. So for any of these, you need to make sure you have evaluations that are up to date, usually within 3 years of when you're applying. For adults, it's allowed to be 5 years sometimes, though a more recent evaluation is always going to be most accurate. But vocational rehabilitation, they're going to look at, your physical needs, psychiatric, intellectual, all of those things, and do the things to help you prepare. But if you are getting SSI or SSDI, so the Social Security Disability Income, you can still access these supports. You can still work. I didn't mention Social Security Disability Income. That is actually benefits for those who become disabled as adults who have a work history. So if you have been working and then suddenly you can't work because of a disability, and you have already received so many years of Social Security payments, like set aside through your paycheck, and now you're disabled, you would apply for SSDI. Most of our individuals with autism spectrum disorder need to be applying for the supplemental security income, which is for those based on disability alone and having been disabled before the age of 26, so to speak. So that's important to know, that difference. But within the vocational rehabilitation model, if you are getting those checks but you need their support, you can still access it. The supports can include a lot of things sort of beyond the job itself, vocational evaluations or diagnostic services. It can include some assistive technology or transportation. These have to be very tied to the job. College and vocational training, that again has to be tied specifically to the job. So if we have done, some vocational evaluation and determine that some trade school will help you meet your employment goals, then it's possible that VR could pay for those classes. So it has to be very, very specific. But it's always good to know what's possible and to ask whether you might be eligible for it. So that's sort of this big overview. I know that was so fast. We covered a lot of bases, but knowing that here we have this individual with autism, we do need to know what their needs are. Not everybody needs the same thing, but we do need to know, what the funding sources are, what providers are available or services are available for this individual based on what we've done. And I am going to remind you that this really involves being your own case manager. It is a full-time job, applying for these things, keeping track of all the funding sources, the correspondence, the evaluations. But it's important to educate yourself, as that person who is the point person here. Educate yourself on your child's diagnosis, and learning how to teach them new skills yourself. I mentioned that there is this big waiting list for the North Carolina Innovations Waiver. It doesn't mean that your child isn't going to work on skills in the meantime. You as a parent can learn to integrate strategies into your home life. This is something we did. I do a lot of workshops on this topic. And there are other ways to get services. So it's always important to set goals at home and work on new skills, always moving forward toward greater independence. If you are on the registry of unmet needs, then you want to make sure you're staying in contact with the managed care organization, with your care coordinator who oversees the plan that is serving your child, or if you're waiting, to make sure that you're moving through the registry of unmet needs. If you are working with providers because you already have services, make sure you're aware of what goals they are working on, whether it's a speech therapist at school or in private setting, or somebody providing in-home skill building. Know what goals they're working on to make sure that they are being met and measured, those sorts of things. Keeping track of documents is a really important thing. If you get documents, I keep a binder for each year, and I have separate tabs for evaluations, for information from different providers, examples of work or visual supports I've created. I keep that all from year to year in separate binders. So I have a whole ton of binders now. My son's 26. And then if you are reaching out to providers, you're making a phone call, keep track of when you make that call. Of course, email will document that if you reach out by email, but if you make a call, taking notes, who did I talk to, what date, and keeping that in the binder as well is a really important skill as a case manager of your own. It's a role that we end up playing as parents. But it's really important to remember that sometimes there's more than one way to get what you need. So like the example I gave earlier, a parent might call and say, I need a referral for a psychologist. And I will ask, what seems to be the issue? And I can sometimes direct them to other resources that might help address the same need, and maybe be accessible more quickly, or maybe at less expense, sometimes more expense. It will vary, but there may be more than one way to get from point A to point B. And that's where, again, the autism resource specialists can be a resource. So if services are out of reach, let's say you apply for something and you are told that your child is not eligible, it's really important that you file an appeal, because there is an appeal process in place. Maybe, having that second look will help. Sometimes it will allow you to present more data, more information that might help them understand better. But if you're not sure, you can always reach out to the Autism Society of North Carolina, find your autism resource specialist, talk it over with us. We may have some suggestions. And then it's also important, especially when it comes to the innovations waiver, the home and community-based Medicaid waiver, that you contact your representatives in Raleigh and share your story and your situation. We have a toolkit on our website. If you go to our website, Gain Knowledge tab on our main page and click on the toolkits, you'll get to our Advocacy 101 toolkit that talks about how to find your representatives, how to write that letter, has some great examples. This is one of those times where you need to let somebody know, I have a kid with autism who really needs some help and support, and we can't access it because of this or that. They need to know. And so that's an important step that you can take. The Autism Society of North Carolina has other resources as well on our toolkits page and our webinars page that will help you with some of these things. In particular, you'll see under our webinars, we have a whole thing about ABLE accounts. If your child is 18 or about to turn 18 or already over 18, This information is presented in a slightly different way in your child, your teen just turned 18, and then some other specific webinars on topics like guardianship and residential options. Of course, we have toolkits on IEPs and accessing services that explain these things in detail as well. I also want you to know about Disability Rights North Carolina, which is the North Carolina Protection and Advocacy Agency. They have a lot of information related to services, especially Medicaid funded services and Social Security, information on guardianship, and a lot of those things that have legal implications. That is their wheelhouse. They do not provide just legal representation for anything, but they do have a list of targeted goals for the year, and sometimes these things will fall under that, and they will want to help. So they like to know. Within the vocational rehabilitation program, there's the North Carolina Client Assistance Program to help you navigate those VR services. That's a great website to check out if you're the parent of an adult. And then finally, here's that link again to our webpage and the Autism Resource Specialists. Like I said, we're all parents of children with autism. My contact information is here.